All right, so in this lesson, we're gonna have this roller object here, or a ball in this case, just roll across these wavy little shapes here. And to do that, you need to both animate the X position, moving it right or left, and also the Y position, moving it up and down in correlation with each other. So that's a really good exercise, I think. And we're also going to loop this entire animation and do that in a nice and easy way that doesn't require a lot of work. We don't want to animate the same thing over and over again. So I'll show you some nice little tricks on how to do that and how to make this entire sequence loop in the end. So I'm going to stick with the ball for this first one, and then for the next objects that we can animate, we can switch to another model. But if you want to move ahead and switch to something else, then the way to do that is just to find this little rollers group here, so we can just expand that. And if you select this roller instance here, we can just head into objects here, and then we can use this pick whip tool to just select any other ornament that you want to use here. It might be good to use an object where you can actually see it rotating. So for example, this flower model will work for that. The hourglass, for example, it won't, because if you rotate it, you won't see any difference in terms of the rotation of the object. So you might want to avoid that. We can get around that by shading this model a bit differently, but we can get down to that once we've gotten the animation out of the way. So I'll just switch back to our sphere here, and I'll just fold in this null again. This is also something that you can maybe do once we're done animating, but if you want to change colors, you can easily do that by just altering the colors of each wave here so they're all linked. So if you want to change that around, that's very easy to do. But yeah, as I said, you can do that once we're done animating. It won't change anything in terms of the process. So basically what we're going to do is animate one section of this sequence and then loop all of these movements over and over again so they play out seamlessly, basically. So the first thing that we can do is just animate this first section, which would basically be the ball rolling down this first wave and then up to the next one. And then we'll just repeat this over and over again using one of Cinema 4D's functions. So we will start with the X position in this case. So I'll just select this roller animation null here, which is what we will be animating. We don't want to animate the actual geometry. As I've said before, we want to avoid animating objects that we can't easily switch out. So this null is an empty item, so this is perfect to animate. So we will start with the X position in this case. So the first thing that we can do is just select our roller animation. We'll hop into the coordinates here and we'll set our first keyframe for the position X, like that. We can just go ahead and pull that into our timeline just so we make sure that it's there. And we'll go ahead and move to frame 32, like that. And we'll hop into our front view here. I've made sure that each of these waves are 200 centimeters apart. So if we just move it 200 centimeters to the right here, like that, we'll end up on the center. But if the design isn't that precise, you might just have to eye this. But this makes it easier to loop when you're working in even dimensions like this. So at frame 32, I moved the sphere 200 centimeters to the right. So I'll just go ahead and set our second keyframe like that. And we have a beautiful movement from left to right, like that. Lovely. So we'll go ahead and set our keyframes for the Y position. So we'll go ahead and set the first keyframe here at position Y at frame 0. We'll move on to the halfway line, which is 16 frames. So we're animating 32 frames in total in this section. So at the halfway line, that's 16. And we'll go ahead and hop into our front view here and just pull this down so we're like approximately at the right place. So I think like 181. It's going to be fine. You always want objects to intersect just a little bit rather than be floating, because you can tell very clearly when something is floating, but you can't tell that easily if it's like intersecting a little. So that's why I'm always like pulling them a bit further rather than too little. So we'll go ahead and set our keyframe here at position Y like that, and then we'll move on to frame 32. And we can set it back at 281, I believe it was, right? So 281, set our keyframe right there. And we just go ahead and zoom out. And we can go ahead and hop back into our perspective view. And obviously, as you can tell by the motion path, this is not the type of movement that we want. So the first thing that we can do to alter this is head into our position Y. We'll frame up all of these keyframes by selecting them and hitting S like that. So if we hop back into our front view here, because this is just the easiest way to look at it, we can start by expanding the first and last keyframe of this sequence. So I'll just select both of them. I'll hold Control or Command to pull them straight. And once we start to do this, you can see what's happening. Like this is the kind of effect that we want to achieve, right? So it's already starting to look much, much better. So we can just go frame by frame and look at this. So it's still intersecting a bit too much here. It's not really making the type of trajectory that I want. So I think we can solve this by just shrinking down the tangents here as well. So something like that. And that's definitely better. Let's see if we can reduce the intersecting here. So just select these again, increase the easing in even more, something like this. But that also creates this weird floating here, so we don't want that. So I'll just increase the tangents on the middle one again, something like this. It is a bit too abrupt, so I think we can actually reduce these ones again. So we'll just pull these back so they look something like this. And I think we can avoid these things happening by adjusting the position X instead. So if we just hop in here, we'll probably want this curve to be a bit more linear. So if I just decrease like the angle on these tangents, something like this, I think we're gonna get the result that we want. So let's take a look at this again, something like that. Yeah, that's much better, I think. So let's go ahead and play this. Nice. Let's look at this in the perspective view. I'm just gonna pause so the textures can load like that. Great, yeah. I think that's looking really good. Obviously, this looks really weird when the sphere isn't rolling or rotating. So we'll go ahead and add the rotating movement at the same time. So to achieve the rolling motion, we will animate the rotation P here. So I'll just hop back to frame 0. We'll set our first keyframe at frame 0 for rotation P. We'll hop all the way to the end, so at frame 32 here. And let's just do like 360 for now, just to see what this looks like. I don't know the mathematical way to achieve a perfectly rolling motion in correspondence to the distance traveled and stuff. I just kind of eye it, so that's what we're going to do. So I'll just make sure that I set this keyframe here. And we'll hop into our rotation P. I'll just hit Control A and S to frame it up, and we'll just take a look at how this is looking. Now, obviously, even without tweaking any curves, I can see that this is way too little of a rotation. So we'll just go ahead and maybe add another 180 degrees. So I'll just double click my keyframe here, and I'll just add a plus and then 180, and that will add 180 degrees like that. Yeah, I reckon this feels good. I think we can maybe tweak the tangents just a bit so we increase the easing of the motion. Let's just try that. We can look at this in the front view, and I'll go ahead and activate the quick shading just so we can see the colors and so on. So we'll just look at it from here. Yeah, that feels really nice. I'm just going to just view this one frame at a time just so we can really look at these rotating movements. We just don't want any like obvious spinning and stuff, but I think this looks really nice. So I'll hop back to my perspective view. It might be spinning a bit as it comes up, so I'll just go ahead and reduce the easing just like that. Yeah, okay, yeah, we'll be happy with that. So the next step is just to make this entire section loop, so we don't have to animate every single up and down and rotating movement throughout this entire sequence. So Cinema has a really easy and nice way to do this. So if we just hop into the position Y here, once we select this animated attribute, you can see this like track attribute popping up here. So if we head into the after here and select repeat, just like that, and we can go ahead and frame up our curve. So I'll hit Control A and S. And now we can actually see this black line here as a continuation of our animation. So it's doing this loop every 30-second frame. So if we just take a look at this, it keeps doing that movement. Now, obviously, we haven't done the same thing for our position X and rotation yet, but we'll get there. So if we select our position X here and do the same thing here, we select the repeat and try and play that. Now, obviously, this is not what we want. So we're snapping back to the position that we originally set. So we want this to repeat, but to offset it. So luckily, Cinema has that kind of option. So if we just select offset repeat, it will repeat the movement, but offset it by the amount that we're originally animating. So now if we go ahead and press play, now we get this looping motion that we want. So if we do the same thing with our rotation P, like that, just select it and hit offset repeat, like that. And now we have the final rotating sphere. And now that we kind of have this movement in place, I do see that we are sliding a bit in terms of the rotation. So to avoid this, I'll just go ahead and select our rotation P, Control A and S. We can go ahead and angle these tangents, because if a sphere is rolling up this kind of hill and then continues to roll downwards, that means that it's never really losing momentum. And right now, since we have these tangents flat, we are like basically coming to a standstill at some point. So if we just angle these a bit like this, so just downwards, just make sure that we have both of them selected, because if you just angle one of these, you'll have a weird loop. So if we have them like this, we can just go ahead and try and play it. And that feels a lot nicer, I think. So now it never really comes to a standstill. It kind of just eases out, never really stops, and then just keep rolling. All right, great. So we have our looping motion here. However, once the sphere exits the frame and we get to the end of our preview range, we don't really have a loop since the sphere exits the frame, right? And it never really comes back. So to do this, we need to kind of keep in mind how far the sphere is traveling. So we have animated a section of 200 centimeters, so from -100 to +100, so that's 200 centimeters. We basically need 4 full sections of our rolling ball to complete a loop, because our rotation is rotating 540 degrees each time, which is 1 turn and a half. So if we, for example, have 3 cycles of it, so let's say that it travels for 32 times 3 times, which is 96 frames, then it won't actually end up as a loop, because then it will end up with the white cap upwards and we start out with the yellow cap upwards. So that means that we want at least 128 frames or 64 more frames than that, and so on. So these are the things that we kind of need to keep in mind when we are making loops. It gets a bit mathematical. But if we have 128 frames, that's 32 times 4, which means that we have 4 sections of this loop. So now the ball ends up with the yellow cap upwards, and that's what it needs to actually loop in the end. So now we have the length of our preview range. So we also know that the ball travels in total of 800 centimeters, since it moves 200 centimeters per section. So what we basically need is a duplicate of this animation to enter the frame from the left hand side, somewhere around here, so it ends up at the exact same spot as the sphere starts at. So instead of duplicating this and having a completely new animation, we can actually just create an instance of this, which is a copy linked to this animation. So if we do end up making changes to our movements, it will also affect the duplicate. So to do that, we need to actually group this animation, because if we create an instance of this, the attributes that we have just animated won't translate. So I need to add this to a completely new group. So if we just add this null here, we need to make sure that the null is at the center of our scene. So I'll just name this ball loop like that. We'll pull in our roller animation null in here like that. And now if we select this ball loop group here, we can come over here to our subdivision surface icon here and just click and drag, release on instance. And now we have created if we just move this across here, we have created a duplicate of the animation, which is perfect. And if we end up making changes to this will be linked. So that's really, really handy. So to make this new duplicate here end up on the same frame that our original animation starts on, we need to move this 800 centimeters to the left, since that's the distance it travels in the X position. So I'll just go ahead and drag and hold shift here, and we just drag this all the way over to 800 centimeters. So we have dragged this instance all the way over there, and now if we just look at what this does, now it ends up at the exact same position as our original animation. And we didn't have to add another unique animation. We could just create a duplicate of our current one. So I'll just come back to our perspective view here, and we'll just play this just to see how it feels. Great. That's really, really good. So as you can tell, it kind of stops at the looping point here, which is at frame 128. And that is because Cinema 4D has the frame range from 0 to 128. So that means that we essentially have 129 frames counting the 0. So if we want this to fully seamlessly loop, as in this last frame being the frame just before it resets, we need to decrease the amount of frames. So set it to 0 to 127. So now it will much more seamlessly translate into the loop. So now we have this really nice animation. Obviously there are other wavy like surfaces for objects to roll on, so we can go ahead and add a few more of those. And since we have the foundation of our animation done already, this will be super quick. So what we can do is actually create another group which we will nest all of these objects that we have currently. So I'll just create another null here. We'll drag this into our scene. I'll go to frame 0 just so we are at the start, and we can name this ball loop group, which isn't confusing at all. So I'll make sure that my ball loop instance and my ball loop null is all within this Godfather null here, which kind of contains everything. So now regardless where I place this, even though I mess up the positions, this will loop regardless. So that's really good to have, so in case you misplace anything. So if I just go ahead and duplicate this, I'll control or command drag here in the objects manager to just duplicate this group. I'll make sure that we kind of rename things as well. Maybe call this, I'll make a flower maybe. Flower loop group. Maybe that'll look great like that. So with that in place, we'll go ahead and move this out of the way so we can see the changes that we're making. So I'll just shift this 50 centimeters or 100 centimeters in the Z value here. And we can go ahead and select this roller instance here. And if we expand this rollers group here, we can actually just add another object in here. So I'll take a flower here in this case, and I'll take this entire flower loop group here and just drag it over to maybe this next hill here. So that's 300 centimeters. And then we also need to move it up because that's at the apex of it. So something like this. And now if we play this, you're going to see that we have a fully looping set here, which is great. Perfect. Now, if I want to kind of offset these, because these are all rolling in the exact same place, right? So I kind of want to offset this flower keyframes here. So if I just take my new roller animation in here, we'll call this the flower animation, just so we're very organized. I'll just drag this one in here like this. And if we make sure that we have all our keyframes selected, so I just hit Control A here, we'll zoom out like that. And I'll just go to frame 0. We can actually just drag these keyframes back. So I'll just set it to somewhere around there, and it will still loop. So that's really great due to our instance and making sure that we have our distance covered and so on. So yeah, I think that looks really good. Let's go ahead and play this. Yeah, this is really fun. So I might want to add a third object, maybe rolling on this pink wave here. So I'll just go ahead and do the same thing over again. I'll duplicate this flower loop group. So instead of renaming things manually, we can actually use a tool called the naming tool here in Cinema. So if we just make sure that we select all of our objects here with the word flower in it, I'll do that and then come up to tools here, naming tool. And if we just go into replace here, so we say that we want to replace the word flower with, let's maybe do an blurb for this one. So if we just hit replace name now, it will replace all of the flower words with blurb, which is great. Just a bunch of nonsense. So let's go ahead and move our blurb group out to the pink wave here. So that will be minus 100 centimeters, I think, and we'll move it down something like that. So that would be, let's just view this in the front view. Oh yeah, let's make sure that we're on frame 0 so we see clearly what we are doing here. So it will be at like minus 100. Perfect. So we can go ahead and scroll forward here, and we'll want to obviously change this to a blurb now since we have it named as that. So like that, beautiful. And I think I want to offset the keyframes for this one as well, because this feels like it's moving in synchronization with the flower here. So if I just pull in our blurb animation here to our timeline, we select it, and we can just make sure all of our keyframes are selected, and then we can just kind of slightly tweak the timing of it like that. Make sure that you hold shift when you are pulling like this, because otherwise you might mess up some things. Oh yeah, let's do that. We can just kind of play around with this, see what we like. I just wanted to feel like all of our objects are moving like individually and not like in sync. So I think that looks great. So let's add some colors to this. So as you can tell, I have a bunch of colors here that we can use from these wavy shapes. So if we just open the material manager here and we make sure that the materials layer is selected, we can just pick whatever colors that we have here in the scene to begin with. If you want to create your own materials, then feel free to do that. But I'll stick with the ones that we have for now. So if I just expand this flower loop group here, I'll take a pink. I think will look really nice. So I'll just drag and drop that onto the material tag here. And for the blurb, we kind of need something that shows the definition of the shape, since it's just a cylindrical object. So when it's rolling, it won't really show. So it would just look like the shape is moving up and down. So to do that, we can actually add a gradient to the shape. So you kind of see the gradient rotate at least. So I have this gradient material prepared. So I'll just go ahead and drag and drop this onto the material tag here. And since it is a gradient, it might look a bit strange in terms of the projection. So to make sure that we avoid any weirdness with the UV mapping, I'll just close the material manager. I'll just make sure that I switch the projection type here to flat instead. And while I have the material tag selected, I'll just go to our texture mode here. And let's see here. Oh yeah, the object was out of frame. So I'll just hop out to our perspective view here. And I'll just make sure that it's projecting flat from the Z axis like this. So I'll just scale it down so the entire ramp gets covered across the shape like this. And you can actually just take a look at how this is looking in the renderer. So I'll just come up to the Redshift tab here, go into render view, and we can just take a look at how this is registering. So yeah, right now we have this gradient being like cast across from this side to the other. So now we are showing the rotating movement, which is great. If this was just a solid color, it wouldn't show. So that's perfect. So yeah, I'll just go ahead and close our Redshift render view here. So yeah, I think we have a really nice looking animation here. Obviously, since we are like duplicating things and adding new objects to the scene, it might feel a bit confusing, but I think this is a really good way to do a loop without having to create too many different objects. We still only have we don't have many keyframes per object, and we have this amount of animation, which is great. So if you want to render this out, obviously hop into our render lesson at the end of the course just to see how you can set it up with the aspect ratios and stuff. So yeah, it's pretty straightforward. So if you know Cinema 4D and Redshift, you can probably do it on your own. But yeah, other than that, I hope I'll see you in the next lesson where we'll talk a bit about axes and parents maneuvering and so on. So that should be full of some new information and it will turn into a really nice animation. So yeah, I'll see you over there.